Mr. Simmons was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea and was looking thoughtfully out the window. Once in a while, he would look at the wall clock and sigh sadly, dissatisfied with what he was seeing. The old man was sad because his son Simon and his daughter-in-law Cheryl were staying late at work. This wasn't the first time it happened, and thus Mr. Simmons was getting suspicious. Nevertheless, Simon and Cheryl always had a compelling and logical explanation for their late arrival. According to the spouses, there was a lot of work at the company, and so they had to stay at the office and work overtime. But Mr. Simmons didn't buy it. The elderly man believed that his son and daughter-in-law were deliberately avoiding him. He thought that they simply didn't want to spend time with the emaciated, sick old man who was forced to ask his relatives for help because of his frailty. The fact was that Mr. Simmons used to live on his own in a small house outside the city just 1 year ago. The old man had a garden and a lawn which he always kept in impeccable order, even despite his age. His wife died a long time ago, and the man was used to dealing with this problem on his own. His life was fine until an unfortunate incident happened one day. Mr. Simmons went out grocery shopping, and a fire broke out in his old house. Unfortunately, the fire was impossible to notice in time, and thus, in what seemed like a blink of an eye, the entire building was engulfed in flames. It's hard to say what exactly caused the fire, but the firefighters who arrived at the scene kept saying that it must have been a short circuit in the electrical wiring. By the time Mr. Simmons, laden with grocery bags, got back to the house, all that was left of it were smoke and embers. When the old man saw what happened to his home, his hands unclenched and the groceries fell to the ground. Mr. Simmons was so shocked by what he saw that he immediately felt sick and fainted. The ambulance that arrived at the call took the old man to the hospital, where he was diagnosed with a stroke. Losing his home came as a hard blow for Mr. Simmons and turned out to be very difficult for the man to get over. Unfortunately, the stroke caused temporary paralysis of the limbs, which was an even bigger problem than losing his house. Few people knew that more than anything in his life, Mr. Simmons didn't want to impose on the family of his son, who moved him into his home as soon as he heard the diagnosis. "Son, you should have just left me at the hospital, or send me to some kind of hospice. Why would you want such a burden in your life?" the old man said, trying to keep Simon from seeing tears well up in his eyes. But Simon didn't want to hear any of it. He loved his father, and despite his diagnosis, both Simon and his wife were willing to take care of Mr. Simmons. Several months passed. Thanks to the competent treatment and Mr. Simmons' strong desire to get better, movement slowly returned to his previous immobilized body. At first, all he could do was wiggle his fingers and toes, and then, inspired by his success, he eventually began to move his limbs. And the day when he finally managed to get out of bed on his own was probably one of the most important days of his life. And it was then that the old man got set in his idea that he had to move out of his son's home and go live in a nursing home instead. Moreover, there was an elderly neighbor there who added fuel to the fire. She kept telling Mr. Simmons about her daughter and son-in-law, who allegedly wanted to get rid of her as soon as possible and were simply waiting for the right moment. "They criticize me all the time, you know. I put the cup down the wrong way. I woke up too early and then woke everyone else up. It's an awful way to live your life. So every day, I just sit and wait for them to send me off to a nursing home," the woman confided in her neighbor, looking sadly into his eyes. These conversations obviously caused Mr. Simmons to feel bad for the rest of the day. Moreover, the old man saw that Simon and Cheryl had become more secretive recently, and for some reason he didn't know, they started staying late at work, only returning home after dark. "They must be disgusted with me. That's why they stay away from me, and they're too cowardly to tell me the truth," thought Mr. Simmons, waiting for the couple to return home. Simon and Cheryl were gone for a long time, and when the front door finally opened, the old man shocked the couple with his news right there in the doorway. "My darlings, I thought and decided that I don't want to be a burden to you, so I have only one request. Please send me to a nursing home, I beg of you." Simon and Cheryl looked at each other anxiously and then lowered their eyes in embarrassment. "Well, it looks like I've hit the bullseye with my request. Just look at them," lowering their eyes. the old man thought bitterly. But to his surprise, Simon took his hand and said, "Dad, let's talk about this later, okay? Now is not the right time for this conversation." Mr. Simmons shrugged his shoulders indifferently, making it clear with his whole appearance that he wasn't going to change his mind under any circumstances. The rest of the evening was rather uncomfortable, as everyone was feeling tense. Simon and Cheryl were both silent, each buried in their laptops. In the meantime, Mr. Simmons was eager to build on his success, so he kept talking enthusiastically about how good the nursing home would be for him. Of course, deep down, he didn't actually want to part with his son's family. But on the other hand, he was afraid to be an inconvenience to his relatives. Therefore, the old man decided to be proactive, initiating his move to the nursing home. To prove that his intentions were serious, Mr. Simmons even packed his suitcase so that he could be ready for the move at any time. But time went by, and for some reason, Simon and his wife were in no hurry to fulfill their promise and returned to the conversation about sending Mr. Simmons to the nursing home. Eventually, the old man got obsessive over this thought, so much so that he couldn't find peace of mind or calm down. Mr. Simmons hoped that they would let him work in the garden at the nursing home, and maybe even plant some seeds and mow the lawn. The old man was very proud of the garden he used to keep back at his house. Several weeks later, Simon finally informed his father that he could begin preparing to move to the nursing home. So the defining moment has come, thought Mr. Simmons, with a tinge of sadness. But then, he accidentally noticed Cheryl putting a set of new bedding into a plastic bag. Shuffling the soles of his shoes, Mr. Simmons went out into the street, where the first thing he did was say goodbye to his neighbor, informing her that he was moving to a nursing home. The old woman nodded her head understandingly, muttering that all children are the same, trying to get rid of their old parents as soon as possible. The next morning, the whole family woke up earlier than usual. After a quick breakfast, Cheryl and Simon loaded Mr. Simmons' belongings into the trunk of their car and put him in the back seat. Casting a last sad look at his son's house, the old man quietly brushed off a tear that was rolling down his cheek and closed the door. Throughout the entire journey, Mr. Simmons kept looking out the window, trying not to miss the moment when the nursing home would appear in view. However, to Mr. Simmons' surprise, Simon suddenly turned to a painfully familiar street. The old man tensed up noticeably, and when his son stopped his car right in front of his old house, Mr. Simmons almost fainted. Afraid that his eyes were failing him, the old man began to rub them in disbelief, trying to make sure he was seeing right. But no matter what he did, what he was seeing didn't change. The old man opened the door and got out of the car with tears in his eyes. On the side of his burned-down house, there was now a new, freshly painted house. Mr. Simmons carefully opened the gate and went into the yard, which was full of various construction materials. Looking at the excited Simon and Cheryl, the old man understood everything without words. As it turned out, the spouses' long absences and late nights at work were all due to the fact that they were working on building the new house for Mr. Simmons. Some things they did on their own, other things were done by the construction crew. To say that the old man was happy would be the understatement of the year. All this time, Mr. Simmons thought that his family was looking for an excuse to send him off to a nursing home. Realizing how wrong he really was, the old man hugged his son and daughter-in-law. "Thank you, my darlings. This is the best gift anyone has ever given to me," Mr. Simmons whispered through tears. Simon and Cheryl only smiled in response, and then helped the old man get unpacked and put everything in order around the house. It was then that the new set of bedding came in handy, thoughtfully bought by the old man's daughter-in-law to make his new bed. Now, thanks to the efforts of his family, Mr. Simmons was back to living in his old home and feeling like an independent person and a member of a great family. Mr. Simmons also learned that his son's elderly neighbor was never offended by anyone, and no one was planning on kicking her out onto the street. In fact, the old woman has lived in that building since it was built and was simply coming up with all sorts of conspiracy theories because of her loneliness and boredom. This way, the elderly woman wanted to get other people to feel sorry for her and to pay more attention to her. Mr. Simmons now realized that he shouldn't have listened to the speculations of other people, but should have drawn his own conclusions. After all, each person has their own life and their own problems, which all have different solutions.